Earth's retaliation was so brutal, the enemy still has their people, but their ability to fly was deleted. The sky did not fall when Earth struck back, because Earth had decided that the sky belonged to us once more. It happened in the quietest, most terrifying blink of an eye, the moment humanity traded its desperation for a surgical, absolute precision. The silence of the orbital void was broken only by the hum of the kinetic dampeners. Commander Elias Thorne watched the tactical display, his eyes tracing the golden lines that mapped the enemy fleet. They were masters of the atmosphere, creatures of speed and lift, their ships darting like dragonflies through the gravity wells of their home world. For years, they had rained fire upon our cities, secure in their conviction that we could never touch them in their lofty sanctuaries. They were wronged. We were not here to burn their cities. We were not here to extinguish their children or tear down the monuments they held dear. That was the old way, the way of blind, unthinking rage. Operation Reckoning was different. It was a scalpel, not a sword. The first phase of the operation began with the signal transmission. It was a wide-band broadcast, hitting every single enemy vessel simultaneously. It carried a single, digital payload, a cascade of subroutines designed to exploit the very physics their propulsion systems relied upon. As the data packets burrowed into their navigational cores, the impossible occurred. High above the surface of the enemy capital, a heavy cruiser, the pride of their fleet, simply lost its defiance of gravity. There was no explosion. There was no fire. The ship did not detonate. It simply ceased to be a craft of the air. Like a stone dropped into a deep, still pond, it began its descent. The crews on the ground watched in confused horror as their most lethal instrument drifted downward, its maneuvering thrusters firing in vain, helpless against the sudden, artificial void created in its own operating system. It was not an act of destruction, it was a revocation. We had deleted their ability to ascend. The ripple effect was absolute. Across the hemisphere, thousands of tactical platforms, long-range bombers, and patrol craft suffered the same fate. They did not fall because of a missile strike. They fell because the mathematics of their flight were erased. Humanity had spent decades studying their technology in the shadows of our own occupation, and today we cashed in every secret. Deep within the command deck of the flagship, the tactical officers moved with a terrifying, rhythmic calm. There was no cheering. There was only the sound of keystrokes and the soft, steady readout of the systems being systematically dismantled. Each ship that entered our firing solutions was not engaged in a battle. It was simply being unmade. We focused our targeting arrays on the magnetic couplings of their engines. With a series of focused, low-yield energy pulses, we sheared those couplings away. We did not blow up the ships. We left them floating, drifting, and ultimately grounded. We targeted the ammunition storage, not to ignite it, but to vent it into the vacuum, rendering their weapon systems inert husks. Their civilian cities remained illuminated, glowing like jewels beneath the night cloud cover. We watched the feeds from our satellites, seeing the lights of their homes, the bustling streets, and the markets where life continued in ignorance of the fact that their entire military posture had been lobbed away in a matter of hours. This was the true terror of our retaliation. They were left completely vulnerable, stripped of their power, while their people remained safe. It was a humiliation far deeper than any conquest could achieve. The enemy leadership panicked. Their radio traffic became a frantic, disjointed mess of confusion and despair. They scrambled to launch interceptors, but as soon as a craft cleared the hangar deck, it was caught in the net of our signal dampeners, its propulsion systems locking up, sending it tumbling back toward the tarmac. They were trapped on their own planet, forced to look up at a sky that they no longer owned, staring at the thousands of human vessels lingering in high orbit. We became the silent, watchful sentinels of their doom. The strategy was simple, born from the cold, hard logic of survival. By leaving their homes and governments intact, we forced them to witness the reality of their helplessness without the distraction of martyrdom. They could not point to a destroyed city and cry for revenge. They could only look at their grounded fleet and realize that we were the ones holding the leash. Hours stretched into days. The atmosphere was thick with the remnants of their pride. Thousands of ships lay scattered across their landscapes, grounded in fields, in bays, and on city outskirts, where they had fallen when the mandate was given. They were monuments to their own hubris. Deep in the lower decks of our own command center, a junior analyst stared at the screens. She had seen the cities, the homes, and the parks that remained untouched. She turned to the commander. She asked if it would not have been easier to end it all with a single, massive strike. Thorne did not look at her at first. He kept his eyes on the wall of screens showing the enemy capital, where a military installation had been completely silenced, its weapons stripped away while the school across the street finished its day as if nothing had happened. He explained that destruction is fleeting. He told her that to destroy their military while leaving their society intact was a far greater victory. It ensured that they understood exactly who was in control, and it ensured that they had to live every single day with the memory of their defeat. The enemy tried to negotiate. They sent emissaries up to our orbit, expecting to find monsters. They expected a fleet that had been forged in the crucible of war to be bloodthirsty and chaotic. Instead, they found us. They found a military that had achieved the impossible with surgical, almost clinical, efficiency. Their representatives were escorted through the halls of our flagship. They walked past the quiet, professional crews, the rows of servers that had rewritten the laws of their aeronautics, and the displays showing their own grounded world. They saw firsthand that we could have destroyed them at any moment. They saw the precision of our fire, the grace of our restraint, and the crushing reality that their capacity for war was gone. When they returned to their surface, the message was clear. There would be no more raids. There would be no more fire falling from the heavens. There was only the long, slow process of learning how to live in a world where their wings had been clipped by a species they had once deemed inferior. The final phase of the operation was the hardest. It was the maintenance of the peace. We remained in orbit, a persistent, unmoving weight against their sky. We did not threaten, we did not demand, we simply existed, and that existence was the most potent weapon we possessed. Years later, the historians would call it the Great Grounding. They would write about how humanity had discovered that the ultimate power was not in the ability to burn, but in the ability to command the terms of existence. We had faced an enemy that saw only the verticality of power, the ability to strike from above. We had countered that with the horizontal reality of truth. We had grounded them so that they might finally see the ground they walked upon and the people they had so carelessly put at risk. The lesson was not lost on their society. It rippled through their government and their culture. It became a foundational myth for their children, the story of the day the stars turned cold and the sky stopped listening to their commands. They learned that there is a cost to arrogance, and that sometimes the most brutal retaliation is not the one that kills, but the one that makes you remember exactly why you were defeated. We stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching the sunrise over their horizon. The planet looked peaceful, perhaps more peaceful than it had in centuries. The ships of war were being dismantled by their own hands now, repurposed for transit and trade. The weapons were being melted down into building materials. They were no longer a threat, because they no longer had the means to act as one. The victory was not in the casualty counts, for those were remarkably low. The victory was in the change. We had forced them to reorganize their entire worldview around the reality of our superiority, and we had done it without losing our own humanity in the process. It is a strange thing to hold the power of gods and choose to act like architects. We could have burned their world to ash. We could have turned their cities into craters and their fields into glass. But we knew that to do so would only breed more hatred, more cycle, more war. By choosing to target only their ability to harm us, we broke the cycle. The silence on the bridge deepened as the shift ended. Thorn looked out at the vast, dark expanse of space, knowing that somewhere out there were others. There were other empires, other fleets, and other threats, but he also knew that we were ready. We had shown that we were not just survivors, we were thinkers. We were engineers of our own destiny. The enemy still has their people, they still have their homes, they still have their government, but they no longer have the sky. They have learned to look up with reverence rather than malice, and in that change, we found our own salvation. The final transmission went out across the surface of their world, a simple, non-threatening broadcast. It was a request for open communication, for trade, and for a new future. It was a gesture of mercy that looked like a demand because of the context of our presence above them. They accepted. Of course they accepted, they had no other choice. And in that acceptance, the war ended. Not with a shout, not with a bang, but with the quiet, determined turning of a page in the history of the galaxy. The insight remains for all who would listen. True strength is not measured by the scale of the destruction you can cause, but by the precision with which you can enforce your will. To defeat an enemy is simple. To reform an enemy requires a mastery of both force and spirit. We are still there in the quiet, watching the world we grounded turn beneath us. We are the architects of this new peace, the quiet, persistent, and unshakable sentinels. And as long as the sky belongs to us, the world below will know the peace we have built. When you hold the power to change the world, the greatest challenge is not deciding what to destroy, but deciding what to build in its place. Choose your battles not for the glory of the fight, but for the lasting nature of the peace that follows. Look at the structures of power in your own life, and ask yourself which ones truly deserve to fly, and which ones have been grounding you all along. Take the steps today to dismantle the barriers that keep you from reaching your true potential, and replace them with the foundations of a life you actually want to live. The silence of the orbital blockade was not an empty silence. It was a weighted, watchful stillness that permeated every layer of the enemy atmosphere. Down on the surface, the initial panic of the grounding had shifted into a strange, hollow normalcy. The enemy cities were not burning. They were not being looted. Instead, they were being measured. Commander Elias Thorne walked the observation deck, his boots clicking against the reinforced flooring. He looked down at the sprawling capital of the planet, known as Kalos. Even from this altitude, the geometric precision of their urban planning was visible. It was a world built on order, and we had shattered that order by simply removing one variable from their equation. His executive officer, Captain Sarah Vane, stepped up beside him. She held a datapad that glowed with the latest atmospheric and structural analysis. The logistics of their transition are moving faster than predicted, sir, she said, her voice low and steady. They have begun mass scrapping the cruisers we forced down. The salvage crews are using the very kinetic harvesters we disabled to break apart the primary hulls. It is almost poetic. Thorne nodded, his gaze fixed on a cluster of ships grounded in the vast, arid plains outside the capital. They looked like beached whales, hulking monuments of failed ambition. "It is not poetry, Captain," he replied. "It is engineering. They are a species that understands the value of utility. Once they realized that the propulsion systems were never coming back, their desperation turned to pragmatism. They need the resources, and they have realized that their war machine is nothing more than a pile of high-grade ore." He moved to the console, tapping a sequence to magnify the feed. He zoomed in on a docking bay where a squadron of long-range fighters sat in a rigid row. They were perfectly intact, their wings gleaming under the artificial lights, yet they were utterly inert. Humanity had not just disabled the engines, we had scrubbed the navigation arrays, permanently overwriting the flight vectors with a feedback loop that made every attempt at ignition result in a system-wide reset. We had turned their weapons into expensive, immobile lawn ornaments. The shift in their society was palpable. Without the ability to project force into the atmosphere or beyond, the Kalosian military had lost its political leverage. The civilian government, once a mere figurehead for the admirals who commanded the fleet, was reasserting itself. We watched the feeds of their council meetings. The shouting matches that had once centered on how best to strike Earth were now focused on power grids, food distribution, and the sudden, awkward necessity of terrestrial trade. They are learning that power without the ability to move is just a static weight, Thorn mused. But there were still obstacles. Not every faction on the planet was willing to accept the new reality. Deep within the industrial sectors, there were pockets of resistance, technicians and engineers who viewed our intervention as a temporary failure of their own design. They were working day and night, trying to bypass the digital lock we had placed on their aeronautics. We could see them through the thermal imaging. We could see the sparks of their torches and the frantic heat signatures of their makeshift labs. "Sir, we have detected another unauthorized attempt to breach the gravity-dampening locks," Vane noted, pointing to a red blink on the tactical map. "This time, it is in the southern basin. They have pooled their remaining power cells, trying to jumpstart a propulsion coil." Thorn did not flinch. This was the inevitable reaction. A cornered animal always tests the bars of its cage. "Let them try," he said calmly. "We do not need to drop another pulse. Their own desperation will provide the lesson." The scene in the southern basin played out in real time. As the technicians attempted to force a bypass, the propulsion coil hit the threshold of the forbidden frequency we had broadcasted. Instead of lifting the ship, the instability caused the coil to overload. There was a sudden, violent eruption of localized kinetic energy. It was not a nuclear explosion, but it was enough to shatter the hangar housing the attempt, leaving the project a twisted wreck of scrap metal. It was a failure of their own making. It was a stark, brutal demonstration that the physics of their world had fundamentally changed. From our vantage point, we watched the smoke rise, and we watched the relief efforts move in to treat the wounded, the military engineers standing back in abject defeat. The realization settled over the planet like a heavy fog. There was no way around the laws of nature as we had rewritten them. Months flowed into a year. The blockade became a fixture of their sky, as constant and undeniable as their own suns. We established a stable orbit, our fleet rotating ships in and out to ensure our presence remained fresh and vigilant. We began to send down supply drops, not weapons, but medicinal supplies, energy converters for their civilian grids, and agricultural technology. We were not just keeping them grounded, we were slowly integrating their economy into ours. It was a subtle process of dependency. We were no longer their conquerors, we were becoming their essential partners. They needed our technology to stabilize their world, and we were more than happy to provide it, provided they continued to dismantle their capacity for interstellar warfare. One evening, on the flagship, Thorn stood in the mess hall, watching the crew interact. They were tired, but they were efficient. They knew that what they were doing was different. They were not heroes of a glorious battle, they were the quiet managers of a long, difficult peace. One of the younger crewmen approached him, his expression troubled. "Commander," he began, hesitant, "is this really the right way? We are holding them back. We are stifling their progress. Is this not just a different kind of tyranny?" Thorn looked at the young man, his expression softening. He gestured toward the viewports, where the planet shimmered with a soft, bioluminescent glow. "We are not holding them back, son," Thorn said quietly. "We are teaching them that the sky is not a weapon. They spent centuries viewing the vacuum as a place to hoard power and launch strikes. We have given them a chance to look at their own world and find value in what is underneath their feet. You call it tyranny, I call it a forced education in humility. The young man seemed to consider this. But what if they eventually fix it? What if they find a way around our dampeners? Thorn smiled, a slow, thin line of resolve. Then we will be here to teach them again. And each time they try to claw their way back to a past that caused so much suffering, the cost of that attempt will be higher. They will learn, eventually, that the most efficient way to survive is to be a part of the world, not a parasite upon the atmosphere. The climactic moment of this shift came during a planetary summit. The Kalosian government invited our representatives to the surface for the first time. It was a gamble, a test of our resolve and theirs. Thorn led the delegation. They descended in a shuttle that was not hindered by the dampeners, a stark reminder of who held the keys to the kingdom. As they landed in the heart of the capital, the streets were lined with citizens. They were not cheering, and they were not jeering. They were simply watching. They were looking at the humans who had deleted their wings, curious to see if we were monsters or men. The summit hall was a grand, circular structure, its roof open to the sky we had taken from them. Thorn stood before their assembly. He did not speak of victory. He did not speak of our firepower or the ease with which we could have vaporized their cities. He spoke of the stars. He spoke of the vastness of the galaxy and the potential for a future where their resources and our ingenuity could build something better than the wars they had fueled. We have taken your ability to fly because you used it to create fire, Thorn said, his voice echoing through the silent chamber. You have the capacity to be more than soldiers. You are builders, thinkers, and explorers. We have stopped you from being the former so that you might rediscover the latter. There was a long, suffocating silence following his words. Then, the High Counselor, a figure of aged grace and weariness, stood up. She looked at Thorn, and for a moment the weight of their collective history seemed to pass between them. You have left us with our homes, she said, her voice steady. You have left us with our families, and you have left us with a planet that we are only just beginning to truly know. We did not understand the cost of our aggression until we were forced to look at the ground. The peace was not perfect, and it was not without friction. There were still those who held onto the bitterness of the old days, and there were still moments of tension as the power dynamics shifted. But the war as they had known it, the terrifying, explosive, atmospheric war, was dead. As Thorn prepared to return to the fleet, the atmosphere in the capital had changed. There was a sense of purpose that hadn't existed before. The frantic obsession with the sky had been replaced by a focused, terrestrial ambition. They were building irrigation projects, revitalizing their ecosystems, and re-engineering their infrastructure. The mission was a success, not because we had crushed them, but because we had redirected their trajectory. Back on the flagship, as they prepared for the next shift in the orbital cycle, Thorn watched the sunrise over the curve of the planet. The sky was clear. There were no interceptors, no bombers, and no cruisers patrolling the clouds. The air was silent. The lesson that humanity had brought to the stars was not one of might, but one of perspective. True power is not the ability to dominate, but the ability to guide. The story of the great grounding would be told for generations. It would be remembered as the moment the stars decided that some children were not ready to play with fire and took the matches away. It was a brutal, necessary, and elegant solution, and it had saved both worlds. The insights we gain from such trials are meant to be held close. Every civilization reaches a point where it must decide if its advancement will be measured in the breadth of its conquest or the depth of its character. When you find yourself in a position of overwhelming advantage, do not seek the path of total destruction. Seek the path of total redirection. Break the mechanisms of the conflict, not the people, and you will find that a forced peace often becomes the fertile soil for a better future. Take a moment now to consider the barriers in your own world that keep you from moving forward. Sometimes, the things that keep us grounded are not obstacles, but necessary reminders to fix our foundations before we attempt to reach for something higher. Identify what is keeping you from progress, address the core mechanics of that friction, and start building your future from the ground up, with the clarity and resolve that only a grounded perspective can provide. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible stories. Hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads.